Network.
Let's just get this out of the way right off the bat. Dellamorte Dellamore is a film best explained by the character of the police chief. We've already found the guilty party. After setting fire to the apartment, he went home, killed his wife and daughter, and turned himself in. He's in the psychiatric ward. When our main character, Francesco Dellamorte, attempts to confront the man who he tells us stole his crimes, he's told by a nurse that he cannot, because his friend Franco is in a coma after drinking a bottle of iodide. I'll go into all the details as we progress through the film, but really, that's it. The film is a first-person journey through the psyche of a man in a coma, attempting to put his actions into some kind of intelligible context. Franco, the real man, projects Francesco as his pure self and dim-witted Nagi as a much more childlike and innocent version. The coma dream is self-contained and ever-repeating, just like every time a snow globe is shaken. I don't usually start these videos with such a clear-cut explanation of the film, but here I think it's worth it. Thing is, Dellamorte Dellamore isn't a cerebral film, although it certainly comes off that way. No, it's a purely emotional experience, capturing the sense of guilt and loneliness and existential torment that anyone who's ever fucked up a relationship can completely understand. This is a horror movie, of course, and that means we have to have zombies and murder and sex. That's the language of the genre. But make no mistake, this isn't meant as a deep film. No, it's designed to wash over you and make you feel lots of awkward, almost contrary emotions. Absurdist humor sits alongside truly disturbing moments. The film feels lighthearted and even silly at times, even as it explores some of the most harrowing aspects of humanity. Dellamorte Dellamore is a horror masterpiece. It's one of the genre's most daring and unapologetic successes. It shines bright in a field of drama that is often hamstrung by commercial concerns. It's beloved by many in horror circles, but too often for all the wrong reasons. This film is a juggernaut that deserves not just to be loved, but to be understood. Horror, perhaps more than any other genre, thrives as an elevated art construct. I don't mean elevated here in the A24 sense. It's more about taking a simple idea and slathering it in a tasty coating of exaggeration. Psycho is as much about Marion Crane robbing her employer as it is about Norman Bates. Marion betrays a basic article of the civilized world's social contract. You don't take what's not yours. This is turned against her when a similar breach is committed against her. A hotel's proprietor shouldn't break into your room and murder you while you're naked in the shower. But you see that? One is a very real, unfortunately common trespass, but the horror genre uses it as a springboard for a much more dramatic example, the most effective film murder staged up until then. I talk about dual narratives a lot in these autopsy videos, enough that I wouldn't blame you for making a drinking game out of it at my expense. But that's kind of the foundational dramatic structure of the entire horror genre. Take a basic societal anxiety, amplify it through abstraction, exaggeration, and mirroring techniques, and play it through to its conclusion. I've also often said that it's a genre about mortality and morality, and that's really saying the same thing in this case. Take a real moral or social issue, draw a line between it and a trope such as zombies, mass killers, or vampires, and see where it takes you. We can glimpse truths about ourselves and the society we live in through this process that we can't simply experience any other way, at least not in any legal or healthy way. The surface narrative tells a story in a mostly conventional way, not really much different than a police procedural television show or an after-school special. But just underneath is another level, the secondary narrative, and that's where things can open up, and they can get fun. The secondary narrative doesn't directly utilize plot mechanics, but rather psychological identifiers, visual metaphors, and often cheeky literary tools, such as an eponym, like naming a character Francis of Death. You ready to push play and get started? I certainly am. The film opens with a close-up shot of an incompleted model of a human skull. We see a knife blade, an unattached jawbone, and liquid adhesive. The camera pulls back to reveal that this model sits on a table behind a rotary phone. There's a lot to unpack in just these first few shots. In our last autopsy video, the one on the collector, I mentioned that many movies open with a close-up of our main protagonist, with the camera pulling back to reveal the setting only after establishing the person the film will focus on. It's tried and true, and you'll find examples of it in many, many of your favorite films. Here, it's a model of a skull that's given the hero treatment, and an incomplete one at that. Right from the word go, this movie is telling us that there's something fundamentally wrong with our main character. He's broken, specifically in his head, and incomplete. Also, we meet this totem of the main character before Francesco, or Franco, more or less interchangeable. The phone rings and Francesco answers the call from Franco. The movie doesn't tell us exactly when it takes place, but the rotary phone was already almost off the market in the early 90s. That's not to say there weren't any out there, but they were fading very quickly. It's a subtle nudge to suggest that Francesco is a man, at least a little out of his time, like a man in a coma must be. Franco apologizes to Francesco for bothering him, but Francesco tells him not to worry, that he had to get out of the shower sometime. Again, that's a weird time-based answer. Francesco is introduced nude except for the towel around his waist. Negative movies is almost always code for vulnerable. A knock comes from the door, and Francesco answers it. A zombie stands there, not attacking, looking ready to launch into a sales pitch rather than a lunge at his throat. The zombies of Dellamorte Dellamore are not flesh-eating monsters. Well, not just that, like in Night of the Living Dead. They're really just people, but dead people. Francesco shoots the zombie in the head before returning to his conversation with Franco, saying, "You know how things are. Life goes on." Which is exactly the truth. After his unsuccessful suicide attempt, life has gone on for Franco, at least in his head. The zombies are living representations of his status, caught between life and death, locked in a twisted carnival glass version of the events of his life. Everything is exaggerated and distorted, but the basic events of his life are still playing out, on repeat, like a shaken snow globe. And the film actually shows us that very snow globe in the very next shot. It's a snapshot of the end of the film, of course, but on first viewing, without any context, it's impossible to decipher. Francesco calls for Nagi, who we discover lives in the basement of his cottage house. Well-worn as that is, the notion of an innocent child version of a corrupted man living in his subconscious, his basement, would probably be too on the nose if not for the film's otherworldly, fractured fairy tale sensibilities. Nagi watches television dispassionately. Toy cars sit within arm's reach on a table. He's a child. Francesco angrily yells that he's been calling on him for hours. But does that seem likely? He's only now carrying the dead salesman from his porch. Would he really have taken any more time than to just dress before dealing with that problem and asking for his friend's help? This is another subtle clue of timelessness. In Coma Land, minutes can feel like hours, and months like moments. Dellamorte and Nagi return the surveyor to his final resting place. 12th row, 3rd grave. There's some wonderful irony here in a property surveyor not staying inside the coded boundaries of his final resting place. We'll see something similar in a few moments when we meet Franco properly at his workplace. He's the town clerk, responsible for the town's legal paperwork. But his office is a ramshackle mess, and he seems anything but organized. From Dellamorte's point of view, everyone is bad at their jobs. That includes himself. The bodies he inters just don't stay dead. Hell, he wasn't even able to successfully kill himself. But consider how similar Francesco and Franco's jobs really are. They are both filers, one organizing deeds and permits, the other bodies. Dellamorte seems to lament both professions. As Nagi buries the surveyor and he prepares to repair a broken headstone, he says that tombstones are a waste of marble and that the body should just be buried under the dirt. He and Franco clearly share a common distaste for order and memory, useful to a damaged brain. We're never very far from that model skull. Another zombie rises from the grave. This one stumbles towards them, seemingly brandishing a smallish tree as a cudgel. Taking the spade from Nagi, Dellamorte dispatches the zombie. As sloppy as he is with the managerial parts of his job, he's efficient at putting the dead back down. Why is that, do you suppose? Well, if the zombies represent his situation, half dead, half alive, and if he's refusing to accept his true situation, comatose in a hospital bed after murdering 2 prostitutes, his wife and his daughter, then it all makes sense. He doesn't like order because chaos serves to mask the truth. And he's good at destroying any symbol that might make him recognize what's really going on. He's a classic iconoclast, tearing down his coded memories so that they can't steal his comfortable, distracting fantasy world from him. Dellamorte launches into expositionary voiceover as he drinks and smokes and sulks inside his house. Of course, everything he says is a lie, from his ridiculous name to what's happening in his cemetery. He even misidentifies his job subtly, saying he's the watchman of the Buffalora cemetery, when he's really more of a caretaker. We'll get back to this job title very shortly. Note that he says he sometimes wishes he'd change his name. It's played as a joke. He's suggesting changing his fairly reasonable first name, not the too on-the-nose surname. But in fact, here's an easy example of dark mirroring. An idea is expressed that reflects what's actually happening, but in a context that appears to be the opposite. He has changed his name from Franco to Francesco, but slyly suggests he hasn't by saying he wishes he would. You get that? Did you notice that the skull puzzle is in frame as we get this completely unreliable exposition? He says he calls them returners, but that, frankly, he doesn't know why they want to return. Well, of course he can't fathom it. He tried to kill himself to escape his crimes. If he were to return from his coma, he'd have to face the legal ramifications. Or worse, the realization that he's not the hero of his own story. His speech ends with, "I'm just doing my job," which is to say, keeping the charade going. That's Dellamorte's real duty, to protect Franco the murderer from realizing what he's done. The next morning, maybe, but probably not, time really doesn't matter, Mrs. Caramundo, a senior citizen who visits the cemetery often, comes through the front gates right as Dellamorte opens them. She asks if the cemetery is open, and with some serious deadpan gallows humor, he tells her that it is, for her, any time. It's a cute joke that masks the more serious work the scene is about to do. She greets him as the engineer, and he huffs at the title she's given him. Under his breath, he mumbles that he's not an engineer. But of course he is. He's the builder of this fantasy story. She's a little voice in the back of his head trying to slyly suggest the truth to him, but he pushes back. If you don't like my reading of this, ask yourself, what is the point of this gag, Mrs. Caramundo calling him the engineer, unless it means exactly what I'm suggesting? Just to push the envelope, she hands him a newspaper as he walks in. She doesn't acknowledge doing it, she just does. But she's trying to give him the news. He watches Nagi rake up leaves. When the wind blows them out of the wagon he's collecting them in, Dellamorte explains that Nagi hates when that happens. And then he says, "Oh well, we all do what we can not to think about life." Like his last name, that's pretty on the nose. In a blink and you miss it moment, we see a quick flash of the newspaper that Mrs. Caramundo gave him. He opens to the obituaries. If you pause, you'll see that Francesco is listed in the first box on the top left. Maybe that's where Franco lifted the name from to begin with. More importantly, Anna is there 3 times. No last name, just Anna. The credits list Franco's apparitional wife as she, but she is played by Anna Falchi. And as you'll see, she's about to come around multiple times, and it never ends well for her. In the next scene, we meet her, a statuesque, beautiful woman at her husband's funeral. It's a disarmingly short scene. In most films, the introduction of a major character is dramatic and forceful, usually including a close-up eye contact between characters and dialogue. None of that happens here. Dellamorte watches her toss white flower petals into her husband's grave from a short distance. Her face remains downturned, in mourning. It's all portrayed realistically, like any moment in our lives that's all too brief. In other words, it's entirely from Dellamorte's point of view. Except that is for 2 short clips, both from inside the grave looking up at the mourners. Those can't be from Dellamorte's point of view, can they? Well, actually they can, and they are. We cut to him in bed, staring up at the ceiling and wondering whether he'll see her again. It's as if it's Dellamorte in the grave, staring up at her. And of course, it is. After all, this is the wife that he, in his true form of Franco, murdered. Again, dark mirroring. It's she that is dead and he who is still alive. Barely, at least. To reinforce this point of view narrative, his questions are immediately answered. As he draws water from a well, he sees her reflected. But when he looks up, she's no longer right beside him, as she must have been to reflect that closely in the water. Her black veil floats across a hedgerow, very ghost-like. He finds her placing fresh flowers and says he's come to put water in the vase on her father's grave. Her first word to him is a solid double entendre, not unlike the joke he used on Mrs. Caramundo. She says husband, in one sense to correct him about who she is there to mourn, but also addressing Dellamorte himself. Next time you watch it, pay attention to how she enunciates. The photo of Augusto on the tombstone is of an old man, Now, younger women certainly have been known to date much, much older men, but it's meant as an absurdist joke here. Why would such a beautiful woman be with such a shriveled up elderly miser? You're supposed to disbelieve it. At the same time, it doesn't present itself as a lie exactly either. The fantasy life that Franco is weaving from his hospital bed is intentionally inconsistent. More so as we go on. She does something really odd right then. She dumps the water out of the vase that he's just poured. It's such a quick moment that it seems inconsequential, but the fact that it's there at all suggests that it has to have some kind of meaning. Sure, it could have just been some kooky gag, but if so, you'd expect it to be more pronounced, as calling itself out to be noticed. And I just don't think so. I think the subtle implication is that she's replacing real dying flowers with fake silk ones. After all, real flowers definitely need water, plastic does not. Another quick nod to this not being reality at all, but something manufactured. I love the next bit of dialogue. It has nothing to do with the meta-narrative that I've been discussing, but is simply a cool bit of writing that trusts the viewer has been paying attention. He asks how long the husband has been dead, and she responds, 2 weeks, to which he callously says, thank goodness. He'd said earlier that returners, the zombies, come back after 7 days. Presumably, if this body's been dead for twice that long, he's relieved that it won't be digging its way out of the grave and he won't have to take care of it with a shovel or his pistol. She gets upset, who wouldn't be, and she rushes away. But then she stops, turns towards Dellamorte, and tells him that her husband was an extremely incredible lover. Very shortly we'll learn that Dellamorte has a reputation in town as being impotent. A strange thing to be public knowledge in reality, but very much in line with those naked and high school hallway nightmares we've all had. The dark mirroring continues. We cut to Dellamorte in the shower, lamenting that he messed it up, and he doubted he'd ever be able to kindle anything with her. He asks, will I see her again? Of course he will, many more times than reality would be able to provide. There's also a cool verbal and visual bit of writing witchery here. This scene in the shower could, it doesn't have to be, but there's also no reason for it not to be. The shower that Franco interrupted with his phone call in the opening. Because from there we cut to Francisco walking across the street into Franco's workplace, the town records building. Conceptually, this is Francesco, the mental projection, checking in with his true self. Their conversation has multiple meanings. Visually, watch how the two actors mirror one another through the teller window. Dellamorte says that Franco is the only living people that calls him, which also implies that this scene follows the opening chronologically, and adds that he stops in every once in a while to remind himself what he looks like. The fantasy Franco, Dellamorte, fears losing complete touch with reality, though the messiness of Franco's office means that even here there's an intentional deception. It's a difficult task to find a paper you're looking for in all that mess. The truth is in there somewhere, but it's elusive. The next voiceover line is brutal. You can't live on memories alone. This is him stating that he has to create an alternative world in which he's not the villain. Just remembering what happened to his wife and daughter would be just too painful. Franco asks if he had any returners last night, and he replies, a couple, confirming that the scenes we're watching are not in logical order. Easy to miss on first watch, but it's important. Francesco is an unreliable narrator. If he's lying to us about when things happen, it begs the question if he's not simply lying about it all. Which he is, but not only to the viewer, but also to himself. And the scene's last line from Dellamorte, as Franco searches for an M3 form through his disorganized stack of records. It's just easier to shoot them. Is that why he killed the prostitutes, his wife and his daughter? Because it was easier to kill them than to have them discover who he really was? Outside the records building, Dellamorte faces jeers and insults from the local biker gang, all centered around their belief that he's impotent. He seems to ignore them, instead saying in a voiceover that, at some point, you realize that you know more dead people than living. This is true for him. All of the characters that populate his fantasy life are either real people who he's killed or complete figments of his imagination. Besides Franco himself, who is still a projection but a much more accurate avatar of himself. She makes a second appearance at her husband's grave. Notice that there's now 2 vases, one with wilted flowers and the other still fresh or plastic. This mismatches the previous visit, though, where there was only one, and without water, neither of the flowers would have survived a full day. So exactly where in the timeline are we? Dellamorte attempts to make small talk, but it falls on deaf ears until he tells her that the cemetery might be small, but it has a marvelous ossuary. To this she responds with a Disney princess's sense of wonder. Ossuaries can take a lot of different forms, but in general they're either mausoleums, caves, or freestanding buildings where the bodies of many people are interred, or more likely bones. The most famous example is the Paris catacombs, where the skulls and bones of plague victims are arranged in magnificent, if grim, displays. Why is she so fascinated by the idea of such a place? And not just fascinated. Once inside, she's clearly aroused. Again, as is so common in this movie, two characters have a conversation where they seem to be responding to each other, but are actually talking about different things. She extols her love of the ossuary. He agrees, but is referring to her. She says it is just like in her dreams, and he, so importantly, admits to her that this is my dream. He asks to kiss her, but she lightly refuses. Not like this. She pulls a red cloth off the ground, places it over his head like a shroud, and says, like this, before passionately kissing him through the cloth. But she gets cold feet and withdraws, telling him that she must be faithful to the memory of her husband. A skeleton seems to come alive and draw her into an embrace, tugging at her clothes. She repeats over and over that, I can't, before fleeing the ossuary. Dellamorte finds her by a large fountain, and then they make love by her husband's grave. Dellamorte Dellamore, of death, of love, indeed. She catches sight of small fireballs floating in the cemetery. He tells her not to worry. They're just ignis fatuus, that is, will-o-wisp or foolish fire. In real life, this is usually ascribed to combustible marsh gases, often because of decaying bodies. But here the little fireballs seem sentient and playful. But whether they're marsh gases or something more supernatural, don't they give off the same visual impression as the artificial snow in a snow globe? As the lovers go at it, she says, it's never been like this before. No one will ever make us part. Ever? Well, at least not for a few more turns of the snow globe. Important detail. He's clearly not impotent, is he? So why do the town people believe he is? We'll get there, I promise. Her dead husband rises from his grave. She says she can explain, but the dead man only answers, that's life, before biting her. Dellamorte kills the zombie with the pointy end of an elaborate cross. He carries her back to his cottage. She asks him to reassure him that nothing, not even death, will separate them, and he does. Then she dies before the doctor can arrive. What does the love-making scene tell us? That she and Dellamorte are linked by two halves of the title of this film, love and death. But it also gives us a fantasy version of their real last night together. It would seem that Franco was an unfaithful man who suspected his wife of also having affairs. Then one night he snaps, murders two prostitutes, his wife and his daughter. And then he tries to kill himself, with iodide in real life, but here dramatized as a cross through the head. I know, the daughter is still a loose end, but there's a whole section of the film dealing with that still to come. This shot might be the most telling of them all. After she dies in the surface narrative, at least for the first time we see, the camera draws back, revealing his loaded revolver on a bedside table. The visual language of the scene is unmistakable. This image could fit perfectly inside either the surface or the secondary narrative. Either he's waiting for her to return from the dead and need to be put down, or he's sitting beside his sleeping wife contemplating her murder. Moments like these, ones with dual storytelling purposes, pepper this and so many other genre films. I'm always reminded of American Psycho, which constantly fluctuates between perfectly practical business scenes and bursts of ultraviolence. Too many people ask if Patrick Bateman is really a psychotic killer or not. That's not even a useful question when two narratives are at play and are used to inform each other. Of course he is, and it's absurd to think he is. Both are true, and that's the point. This type of storytelling uses parallels to make statements, or to explore difficult feelings, or to overwhelm and confuse in order to suggest that the world can be overwhelming and confusing. Surface plots alone can't do that. That's why we use this method of telling stories. The next day, again, maybe, who knows, time doesn't matter, Inspector Stranario visits Dellamorte. Remember earlier when I pointed out that Dellamorte envisions everyone as incompetent at their jobs? Well, this might be the best possible example of that. The inspector seems to go out of his way to explain away crimes rather than solve them. Of course, that's exactly what Dellamorte is doing all this time with his fantasy. Point in case, the inspector succinctly describes the death of she perfectly, but does so derisively. And then when the medical inspector shows up suddenly and improbably with his report, Stranario dismisses Dellamorte as a suspect because she died while making love, and everybody knows that Dellamorte is impotent. And by the way, that's probably true. In the real world, or Franco's world, he probably is impotent. Enraged that he can't perform with the prostitutes, he takes out his murderous rage on the sex workers, then his unfaithful wife, and finally his daughter. How do I come to that conclusion? Again, ask yourself why these details are even brought up. Why would the film have Dellamorte mocked for impotence if it was not meant as a clue to what had happened? It should be clear by now that Dellamore is really a locked door mystery more than a proper horror movie. The room in which the crime happened just happens to be a broken mind. Do you remember that skull model? Having brought her dead body down to the ossuary she loved so much, he laments that he's sorry that he lied to her. He clarifies that the lie was about his education. Why would we get this dialogue? It's utterly unimportant, except that it smuggles in the idea of Dellamorte being a liar, or, in storytelling terms, an unreliable narrator. Similar cagey dialogue is used in The Usual Suspects to hint at the true identity of Kaiser Sose. He tells us in voiceover that he doesn't want her to be a returner. He doesn't want to see her again. Dual dialogue again. Surface plot, he doesn't want to have to shoot his dead lover. Secondary narrative, he wants to be free of his guilty conscience, which keeps projecting his dead wife into the fantasy he's built in order to protect himself from the truth. But she does return, rising in an off-white shroud from the slab. Impossibly, but visually very impressive, she blows the shroud off her as if throwing a kiss. It wraps itself around him, echoing their earlier scene at the same location. He fires the revolver, blasting a hole through her head. She collapses back onto the slab. With that, we've just witnessed his memory of the murder of his wife, albeit filtered through his coma fantasy. We'll see more variations of this scene, each much more absurd, but this one tethered to the earlier scene of him sitting over her sleeping body and glancing at his gun. This one is probably the most accurate. Having promised Nagi an ice cream for digging her grave, they make their way back to town and find themselves once again moving through a crowd of heckling bikers. These bikers form this film's Greek chorus, albeit serving a different emotional purpose than they would in, say, a Shakespearean play. A Greek chorus is a dramatic element that comes down from the 5th century stage productions from Greece. Traditionally, 50 performers would take the stage at the beginning of a play and sing both individually and together in a way that would set up the story about to unfold. They would reappear throughout the show, and often their function changed from setting up the forthcoming scenes to commenting on the story itself. Early third wall breaking, as these songs would sometimes be directed at both the audience and the characters on stage. Over time, the Greek chorus has simplified somewhat. We never see 50 singers navigating a story anymore, but think about Jonathan Richman in Something About Mary. He's a framing element, a narrator, and a pundit. That's one of the rare examples where song is even used anymore. At the opening of Bride of Frankenstein, the crowd assembled outside the burning mill serve the mantle of the Greek chorus as they collectively catch the audience up and tell us how we should be feeling about that moment. That may also partially explain Una O'Connor's vaudevillian performance, completely in tune with the cheeky nature of the Greek chorus. What are the bikers taunting Dellamorte about? His impotence, sex drive, and the size of his manlyhood. In other words, high school bullshit. This whole story is in Franco's head, so that means he's created the Greek chorus to torment himself. Just as he dreams of his dead wife, his guilt is also needling him about the insecurities that led to her murder. The town leaders, including the inspector and the medical examiner and the mayor, call him over to sit at their table outside a cafe. In the quickest shot in the whole film, we get a quick glimpse of a neighboring table. In this 2-second clip, we see 2 men on cell phones. While cell phones had been on the commercial European market since the mid-1980s, it really wasn't until a Memorandum on Understanding was reached in 1991 for the technology to become at all mainstream. And by mainstream, I mean available to the very wealthy. This film was made only a few years later, so the implication is that this is the town's highest of high society. But more, it provides an almost subliminal glimpse at Dellamorte's place on the social ladder. Remember his rotary phone? I pointed out that this was already old-fashioned in the early 1990s for a reason. In his coma, Franco is far out of time already. When did these murders occur? How many times has Francesco lived out this fantasy? At the table, a strange change of viewpoint happens. For the first time, we're taken out of Dellamorte's head as Nagi takes notice of Valentina, the mayor's daughter. Of course, since Nagi and Dellamorte are really one and the same, we've only changed perspective on the surface level. But still, we get 2 straight-on portrait-style shots of Nagi and Valentina facing one another. Valentina asks her father questions about what Nagi is and whether her father would buy him for her, but her father doesn't answer. He projectile vomits on her, blowing her off her chair in a fashion similar to the moment when she blew her shroud off in the ossuary. Valentina's biker boyfriend arrives, makes a joke about the situation, and they drive off. I've been looking for the perfect time to snag a still of Nagi to illustrate something, and here it is. Earlier I said that Nagi represents an innocent, childlike version of Dellamorte. There's a very intentional bit of costuming that teases this out pretty explicitly. Nagi is a big man, but his proportions are actually very much like a young boy. Take a look at his clothes. His coat, for instance, is far too large for him, which seems very unlikely. Unless, that is, the filmmakers are attempting to display him like a child dressed up as an adult. That they'd have to find such strangely proportioned clothes to pull off the effect means it can't be incidental. This is purely intentional. Nagi refuses to ride back to the cemetery with Dellamorte. He's upset and throwing a tantrum. Dellamorte assures him that everything is fine, but it sounds an awful lot like a parent reassuring a child rather than an honest assessment between friends. Finally, after Nagi drops down to the roadway bawling, Dellamorte quips, "It's not the first time you've thrown up over a girl." He should know. At home, Dellamorte clips obituaries out of the newspaper and crosses a recently dead man's name out of the phone book. A thought, and this isn't supported anywhere in the film, though I think it may be ever so slightly implied by this even existing. What will happen when no more names remain in the town's phone book? Is crossing out names of the dead a sort of countdown to the end of the fantasy, and presumably his own real death? Or at least when he'll come out of the coma? Again, I want to be clear that this is just where my mind takes me and not necessarily an intent of the filmmakers. But I remember thinking about it on an early watch back in the day, and I've never been able to shake it. Even if it's absolutely wrong, I really like it, and I think I'm going to continue to look at it this way. He checks in on Nagi through a gap in the floorboards, and rationalizes to the still-crying man-child that he'll get over it. And then adds, time passes and nothing seems the same. It just gets worse. Yep. Just as each time he encounters his dead wife in the fantasy, it's different and darker. He asks Nagi what he was even doing with the mayor's daughter, and has to correct him that he's not a child like she is. Dellamorte says that Nagi is a year older than him. Was there a full year of the fantasy with innocent Nagi as the main character? Was Franco in full-on denial of his guilt at all back then, and only gradually introduced Francesco and the incarnations of his dead wife as he slowly attempts to come to grips with what he's done? In the end, he tells his infantilized friend, "What do you care? They'll all end up here anyways." That's fucking grim, wouldn't you say? I think it really means that he thinks relationships are doomed from the outset. He subtly let himself off the hook once again for killing his wife, as if it was all inevitable, as if the death of a relationship and the murder of 4 people are really interchangeable. You already see who Valentina represents in this fantasy, right? Franco's daughter, of course. You should know what that means. In the very next scene, we see her and her biker friends die horrifically in a crash with a passenger bus. It's a very pre-Final Destination 2 spectacle that should really rank a lot higher on most horror fans' splatter scene rankings. Anyway, it's interesting that Valentina's death is portrayed as an accident. Dellamorte's dead wife was bitten to death by her, scare quotes, husband, but Valentina more or less dies out of just carelessness. Did Franco not intend to kill his daughter, but things just escalated out of control, like speeding motorcycles on a highway? Did she see something that she wasn't supposed to, which forced his hand? Also, Nagi and Valentina are linked in this fantasy because both are innocent. Nagi can't even bring himself to defend himself against the returners, right? At the biker's funeral, a girl drops onto Claudio, that's the biker we saw earlier as Valentina's boyfriend's, grave. Claudio's mother confronts the girl, saying that Claudio was promised to the mayor's daughter. A small point, but here we're seeing the idea of a love triangle being smuggled into the story. The story not being told, but intimated throughout, hints that both Franco and his wife were unfaithful. Maybe Franco thought that because he had performance issues in bed, his infidelity didn't count, but hers did. Or maybe he feels that she cheated because he couldn't get it up. In any case, this little bit of mirroring tickles the back of my brain. A scene later, the girl asks Dellamorte if it is true that the dead rise in his cemetery, and he answers, "Go away, I haven't got time for the living." He certainly doesn't. Not while he's still trying to reconcile the dead. That night, or whenever, another of Dellamorte's showers is cut short, this time by the arrival of an undead Boy Scout troop. They're the ones that died in the bus accident with the bikers. Distracted by television, Nagi does nothing to help as Dellamorte dispatches the entire troop. In the process, he fires a bullet through Nagi's television. The important thing here is actually what's on the television that Nagi's watching before Dellamorte shoots it and ends the broadcast. It's footage from the first Gulf War, which ended in February of 1991. This film came out in 1994. This is really the only clue we have as to when Franco murdered his family and attempted suicide. That he has clear images of that conflict and that he believes it would still be being broadcast means that, as long as the film takes place in 1994, the year of its release, Franco has been out of commission for about 3 years. Now, this isn't conclusive. How could it be? But the inclusion of the war footage isn't incidental either. It was a conscious decision. Claudio's other girlfriend trespasses into the cemetery, and we get this shot, which is nothing short of a glorious tribute to Mario Bava's Beyond the Door 2. That has absolutely zero to do with the film's structure or subtext, but it always is one of my favorite moments in the film because Bava is king. And this movie is one that I'm sure Bava would have championed. And completely in tune with the dual nature of everything in this movie, the Bava tribute is cheekily followed by a nod to the album cover of the Meatloaf, Meat and Potatoes, Rock Cheese classic, Bat Outta Hell. The first tribute seems sincere, the second a whole lot more ironic. And that's how this movie speaks. Characters joke, but underneath there's some really disturbing shit to be found. When she catches up to him, she asks Claudio, "You only love me, right?" Of course, he ends up eating her, which she's cool with. But Dellamorte ends up killing them both. He seems incapable of not shooting women in the head, doesn't he? This time, the scene plays out in what looks like it was a whole lot closer to what really happened. He says to himself, "The living dead and the dying living, they're all the same, cut from the same cloth." Is he referring to the shroud in the ossuary? Then he says, "Disposing of the dead is a public service, but you're in all kinds of trouble if you kill someone when they're still alive." He's beginning to make the distinction. The wheels are turning in his head. He's coming to grips with, well, something. He still has a ways to go, but the gravity of committing murder, or several murders, is finally setting in after who knows how many turns of his mental snow globe. Another dead woman, another midnight burial. Dellamorte isn't even feigning that this was a legal accident, is he? If the film were even attempting to present this scenario realistically, surely he'd try to capture some proof of the returners and go to the authorities. But like he said earlier to Franco, he's not going to do that. If for nothing else but his self-preservation, he should. Just burying the bodies like this makes it seem like something else, right? Like maybe he's just killing people? But the movie isn't making that attempt. It's constantly acknowledging that none of this is meant to be taken as hard reality. Eager for Valentina's return, Nagi digs her up and attempts to hasten her resurrection as any child would, with a fairy tale kiss. And despite a pane of glass between them, it works. Because this is a fairy tale in a way. How does the film tell us that she isn't just returning at that moment out of coincidence? Up to this point, the film has explicitly ritualized the zombie awakenings. Always at night, after one of Dellamorte's reoccurring motif showers, alcohol and or tobacco. Here, it's broad daylight, and Dellamorte is not even in the scene. And with that, the perspective has shifted again, following up on the tease earlier at the cafe from Franco's corrupted avatar of himself, Dellamorte, to Nagi, Franco's innocent avatar of himself, the unspoken and unspeaking Dellamore of the title. Of death, of love. Also, notice that the earlier returners had become cartoonish simpleton versions of themselves, still clinging on to their lives but in a dispassionate, far-removed way. Not Valentina. She's pretty much exactly as she was, talking to Nagi with the same youthful arrogance. If it weren't for her muted skin tone, scars, and the fact that she no longer has a body from the neck down, dying just doesn't seem to have affected her much at all. These moments with Valentina and Nagi serve two thematic themes as well. At conflict with each other, but also complementing the overall structure of the secondary narrative. Because Nagi represents Franco before the murders, the innocent man, this scene radiates the idea of a younger Franco and his bride. I mean, why did they bury Valentina in a white wedding dress, white flower head wreath, and veil? But to Dellamorte, the murderous version of Franco, Valentina represents his daughter, the innocent he killed who, unlike his wife, committed no sin against him whatsoever. Both the innocent side of him and the guilty man want their girls back. The young bride who hadn't yet cheated on him, or vice versa, and the doomed daughter caught in the crossfires of his alcoholic, impotent rage. That night, there we go again, time doesn't matter. While Dellamorte prowls the graveyard searching for returners, Nagi assembles the skull puzzle with ease. From the grin on his face, it's pretty obvious that he's done it before, many times. Just as he's restored his love to his life with a magical kiss, he's the side of Franco who understands the situation. He knows exactly how Franco's mind is broken, and perhaps even how to fix it. Of course, to protect the fantasy, he quickly disassembles the model so as not to insult Dellamorte. and to protect the fantasy, let it continue to go. Meanwhile, Dellamorte encounters she, his dead wife, in the graveyard. But now that Nagi has resurrected Valentina, the rules have changed. No shower, no liquor. She playfully embraces and kisses him, while at the same time removing his gun and dropping it into a dark reflecting pool beside her grave. A more distinguishable metaphor for impotence? Nope, there is none. Then, her kisses turn into a vicious bite, one that bears a strong resemblance to the first example of that activity we saw in the original Dawn of the Dead. See what the movie has done here? Franco's inability to perform with his wife led, at least in his eyes, to her hurting him. And we've already seen a few times where that's going to lead for her, haven't we? Except that this time it's Nagi who dispatches her with a shovel. Previously unable to do anything more than shiver in place, Nagi now defends Dellamorte, but only after he's already been bitten. We've just seen a dark mirrored version of the moment that innocent Franco turned. And we've even seen why. Shell-shocked, Dellamorte tells Nagi, "You killed her." Nagi shakes his head no. Now with Valentina back, it's Nagi who wants to protect the fantasy. Waking from the coma would mean losing her, the innocent wife, the loving daughter, all over again, and Franco can't bear that. Then Dellamorte kisses her forehead and admits the truth. "I killed her. I killed the only woman I ever loved." This is a huge moment of clarity for him, even if he's still shrouding it in the vocabulary of a fantasy. He no longer views himself as innocent, and, in a way, he and Nagi have become closer to reunifying into their one true persona, Franco. Dellamorte even doubts that Nagi would have the guts to bash his brain in with a shovel, a moment before Nagi tries to do exactly that. The next day, I'm really going to stop saying things like that. Nagi adds the phone book to a small bonfire Dellamorte is building to dispose of fallen leaves. Remember in that earlier scene it was Nagi that was obsessed with leaves. It's now Dellamorte with the rake, because of course it is. Because they're coming together. My own personal theory about the phone book aside, or not, your call. Burning the phone book is an important moment. Phone books were, I hate 2024, an organized list of people and the numbers where you could reach them. A directory, a roadmap, a guide to our society. But here, where Dellamorte spent his days crossing out names, it's also a totem of the false reality he's built. Franco's record office and the phone book both complement and contrast each other. The disorganized office where only Franco can find critical forms, the phone book where listings continue to dwindle because Dellamorte insists on keeping it perfectly up to date, despite the fact that he's already stated that his friend Franco is the only one he keeps in touch with. Also, remember that quick shot of the cell phones earlier? Cell phones don't show up in the directory. Maybe a bit prophetic of the film to recognize that a day was coming where the phone book would be irrelevant. The ashes of the phone book, Dellamorte's Directory of the Dead, rise up and take the form of the Grim Reaper, who insists that Dellamorte stop killing the dead, they belong to him, and instead begin killing the living. We know that's advice that he has taken in the past. At night, that's a better way to put it, right? Not later that night, but just at night. Dellamorte gets a call from Franco while he prepares bullets and kills that night's returners with his feet up on his work desk. There's a lot of sound going on in the scene. The radio is playing a tinny old song, the returners keep barging in, and it's too easy to miss their conversation. But listen closely, and here's what Dellamorte says to Franco. "Sometimes I feel like shooting myself. How's everything in your life? How are dear Mara and Cynthia? Sometimes I wonder if they really exist, Franco. I mean, you do have a wife and daughter, don't you? I only ask because sometimes I think you've made it all up. Franco, you do make me laugh. You'll get out one day. Buffalora will be nothing but a bad memory. Yeah, or maybe not. If I only could get unstuck. I feel like a fly on flypaper. You'll see, Franco. Mara's going to get tired of you, and Cynthia will grow up to hate you. Then you'll be free. Free to see what the rest of the world looks like. What do you think the rest of the world looks like? The rest of the world? Uh-huh. Who knows if the rest of the world even exists? Sometimes I get ahead of my work." He really has gotten ahead of his work and the story, hasn't he? Here we get the only mention of Franco's wife and daughter's real name. She is Mara and Valentina is Cynthia. Also, he makes reference to trying to kill himself, to Mara's infidelity, and even the fact that his world exists inside of a coma. This phone call is the Cliff Notes version of the film's real narrative, all buried under the sound and visuals of a typical zombie movie. After falling asleep on the phone with Franco, Dellamorte dreams that he drives into town and murders the remainder of the crowd who taunted him earlier. Intercut with the shooting rampage are pages of the phone book, It's a blink and miss it situation again, but the last page we see plainly features the name Francesco Dellamorte. But look closer. There's a second Francesco listed even further down on the same page in smaller print, and the name right under that Francesco is Franco. Dellamorte wakes to the sound of the detective pounding on his door. Turns out it wasn't a dream at all, and that some maniac killed 7 people the night before, and that Dellamorte's car was seen driving around the city center. This is a major mirroring moment. The rampage we saw wasn't a literal account of the murders. The fantasy appearance of the phone book pages on his windshield and flashing across the screen make it clear that this is a dream version of those events. Kind of like how the entire narrative of this movie is a dream version of what really happened to Franco and his family. Dellamorte seems confused. He believes the dream is just a dream and that he only fantasized about killing the men who taunted him. His only answer to the detective is that the murders meant more work. And what is his work? Burying bodies, and the truth, and keeping them dead when they come back to rear their ugly heads. To be clear, I don't think that Franco actually murdered random townfolk in real life. I believe the reason that Dellamorte experiences it as a dream is because it's meant symbolically, even inside the fantasy. That's very different than when he killed She, for instance. Somewhat irrationally, the detective declares that he suspects Nagi of committing the murders and insists on speaking to him right away. Why? It's not made clear. Is this just a convenient shortcut taken in the screenplay? Honestly, my impression is that from this dream massacre onward, the movie makes the conscious decision to abandon all pretense of this being a realistic story. I mean, at all. From here to the end credits, this is the collapse of Franco's fantasy. Internal logic fades away as the truth begins to surface. All grounding is abandoned. For example, before the detective can interview Nagi, but after Dellamorte discovers Valentina's undead severed head inside Nagi's television, a discovery that he seems completely unresponsive towards, the mayor and the town leaders arrive and insist on disinterring Valentina so that photos can be taken of her corpse for the mayor's campaign posters. It's pure insanity. It makes no sense. It's nothing that would ever happen, and that's the point. Franco's dream is losing all credibility, even to Dellamorte, his avatar. Notice also how out of sync the characters are with each other. Valentina's headless body's on display, and the photographer asks whether he should take the photo from the neck down. Hearing his daughter's voice calling to him, the mayor asks whether the detective hears it. The detective answers, "I don't know, it depends." None of these people are reacting sensibly in an already absurd situation. The film is signaling how chaotic the rest of the runtime will be. Cigarette dangling from his mouth, Dellamorte shrugs, squints, and tells the detective, "The plot thickens," when in reality, the movie has just dashed the surface plot against the rocks. A moment later, we have Valentina's head flying across Nagi's room and mauling her father. Physics be damned, just like logic. The film, and Franco's fantasy, is embracing its insanity. But still, that's not to say that there's no connection to Franco's tragic real life. After all, in this scene, we have a daughter attack her father, and then she ends up being shot in the head by Dellamorte. Is this what happened? Did Cinzia attack Franco after he killed her mother? Is this how she accidentally became his victim? Dellamorte shoots the undead mayor as he tries to escape the cemetery, causing him to put up barbed wire too, as he puts it to the new mayor, keep them inside. He's always reinforcing his walls, now desperate to contain his fantasy, try to keep it from getting out of his control. The earlier returners never tried to leave the cemetery walls, but now that's a distinct possibility. The new mayor has come to ask Dellamorte about the M3 report that Franco filed on his behalf. Franco and Dellamorte are now at odds with how to proceed. It seems as if the Avatar is trying to prevent its inspiration from destroying the world it was created to serve. Dellamorte signs a rebuttal. It's all just paperwork, just cognitive dissonance. Is there now a part of Franco that wants to come to grips with what he's done? As if in answer, the new mayor introduces Dellamorte to his personal secretary. It's unmistakably she, Franco's wife Mara, now with a new backstory. It's as if she's been conjured up again to offer Dellamorte the opportunity to come clean. One other thought. As the car pulls away, the new mayor drops his arm behind his secretary in the fashion of a man and woman who are dating. Did Mara have an affair with her boss? Is that what this little gesture is meant to tell us? Dellamorte asks again, just like the last time, will I ever see her again? Of course he will. In the very next scene. Because the moment he signed that rebuttal to Franco's M3 report, the mental snow globe got shaken again. The details became scattered and realigned. She visits him at night, and the very first thing he does is point a pistol directly at her head. She faints, and he carries her inside, losing one of her shoes in the process. The language of the scene, the visual language of the scene, even without a shot, is of a murder. But he hasn't shot her this time, and she awakens. But this time she seems well aware that she and he are trapped in a loop. She tells him that ever since she got to Buffalora, strange things have been happening, and that her own grave and Dellamorte himself are familiar to her. All cool and consistent with the secondary narrative, but then he asks her, "You love me too?" And her answer leaves nothing on the table. She says, "Why? Who else is there?" Yeah, everyone here is Franco, at least some little part of him. There's no one else in this fantasy. But Franco has a surprise in store for Dellamorte this time. She tells him that she can only love an impotent man because a man's manhood terrifies her. And you can imagine why. All that rage-filled testosterone is what led to her getting a bullet in the head in the real world, after all. He lies, telling her that he is, as the townspeople taunted, impotent. She proposes to him on that condition. This is his solution to this cycle of the snow globe, pure love without the corruption of sex. He accepts her proposition, and with that, she kicks off her remaining shoe. Yep, the other shoe is dropped. The cartoonish chemical castration scene that follows is so broad and unreal that it, on the surface, seems to share real estate with Samuel Beckett, Max Fleischer, or the lowest points of the Nightmare on Elm Street sequels. Obviously, I don't equate those three in terms of quality, but rather in using larger-than-life images and ideas to illustrate concepts that are fundamentally unworkable in the real world, but elevate fictional worlds. The size and filthy appearance of the hypodermic needle that the medical examiner plunges into Dellamorte's genitals is ridiculous, and intentionally so. Recovering from the procedure, Dellamorte has become so weak and disoriented that he tells Nagi that he's hovering between life and death, but then adds, "You're right, I suppose I'm used to this condition, because, the coma and all." As Nagi turns Mara away from visiting, Dellamorte throws his bedsheets over his head like a shroud and says, "I'd give my life to be dead." Spoken truly like a man who's attempted to overdose on iodine. Immediately recovering from his post-injection infection, Dellamorte encounters Mara again, but she breaks off their engagement after being cured of her phobia of sex by the mayor, who she now intends to marry. I'm pretty sure this scene would never be put on film exactly like this if it were made today, with its implications of sexual violence having benefits, but it's also played here as a bizarre joke. You could do that in the early 90s, you can't do that now. And it's all locked in dialogue, it's not shown, so sensitive modern audiences might at worst shake their heads at it. This isn't forced entry, not by a long shot. Dellamorte is of course heartbroken. He had himself chemically castrated in order to suppress the inevitable tragedy that every incarnation of this fantasy leads to. For once, he had sacrificed himself not to be the villain of the story, and it still didn't matter. Because no amount of tinkering with his own story inside the coma dream can ever change the outcome in the real world. It's his most crushing defeat so far. From there we go into a dreamy sequence of Dellamorte's descent into depression. The voiceover turns into a sort of cold poetry slam. He tells us, "You look for death in the clear night. You tell her that you still love her, that you are still her slave, that she's still your queen. Death, death, death the horror. No, I'd only do it for the fear. I'd come back just to experience the same fear again. To be afraid, always to be afraid." He's ruminating on his insecurities and his crimes as he searches the streets and bars for something, anything other than the same old nightmare. But he's stuck this time. Having not killed Mara, the snow globe remains unshaken. His terrible purpose is on hold. He's a man in stasis. But then he meets Magna and Laura, two college girls looking to pay their tuition by turning tricks. He's not interested in Magna, but Laura, well, Laura's unmistakably another incarnation of Mara. He seizes the opportunity to reset the snow globe and have one more chance at happiness. After a bout of sex, Laura asks to rest a bit, saying that he's come 3 times already. He clarifies that it's only twice, that the 3rd time was faked. They're not talking about sex. He killed Mara once in the real world, once in the fantasy, but the 3rd time she walked away to marry the new mayor. A silly joke with a deeper meaning. Again. Disappointed, Dellamorte burns the girls alive in their apartment. They wanted money, not true love. And killing them is really the only way to start the cycle over. But he's done hoping for better outcomes this time. He says, "This time I'm really through with love." It's easy to imagine Franco saying this to himself on the night he drove to murder his wife and daughter. And that's just what the detective visits him the next day to explain. Franco, the Franco on this side of the wall of sleep, has been arrested for the fire, as well as for killing his family. Dellamorte becomes agitated, stating that his friend has stolen his crimes. He knows that if Franco has finally fessed up to his actions, that he, Dellamorte, the Avatar, serves no purpose. The fantasy is meaningless. The Avatar becomes irrelevant. He visits Franco in the hospital. He stares down at his friend, at himself, unconscious in his coma, so reminiscent of the earlier shot of Dellamorte standing over Mara. When Dellamorte kills a nun, Franco mumbles, "Everything's shit. The only thing that's not shitty is sleep." Dellamorte asks him, "Don't you have anything to say to your only friend?" Franco responds, "I don't know you. Go away. Go away." Franco is rejecting the fantasy and wants to send Dellamorte, the man whose story he's been using as a means to avoid guilt, away for good. The camera pulls back, revealing the hospital room to exist only in a black void. The shape of the illuminated room? Round, like a snow globe. Dellamorte screams out a confession to the detective when they meet on a spiral staircase, but his admission is ignored. Even to the other characters in this fantasy, he no longer has any explanatory value. His agency is nil. He returns to the cemetery and wanders the graveyard, shooting at statues. There are no more returners to kill anymore. The zombies aren't rising. The meaning of his life is null. He speaks again to the Angel of Death, but no longer as a robust phantom, now only as a granite statue. He tells Death that he's leaving. The statue asks him where he intends to go when he doesn't even know the difference between life and death. He's being challenged to accept the truth that his whole story has been a lie, that he has no future because the past he's known is not his own. Nagi watches from a window and cries. Dellamorte and Nagi, and importantly, a coffin, leave the cemetery in his old car. They drive across the countryside, past the town limits, onto a freeway. Dellamorte says that he's never been this far, and as they enter a tunnel, he asks Nagi, now asleep, what he thinks the rest of the world looks like. Even though he gets no answer, he responds as if he did, which is the point, isn't it? Nagi and he are one and the same, two parts of the same man, the child and the imaginary murderer, neither useful anymore. Of course he can hear the answer to the question he poses to himself. But they can't escape, of course. They've reached the edge of their world, the end of the coma fantasy. There's really nowhere to go. I should have known it, he said. The rest of the world doesn't exist. Nagi collapses to the road, the innocent child more sensitive to the reality of no reality. Dellamorte still clings to the last threads of the fantasy, thinking that Nagi collapsed because he hit his head. Nagi stops breathing. Dellamorte gets his gun and prepares to execute his friend before he can return. But then snow begins to fall around him. Nagi's death is causing the snow globe to shake. Another cycle is coming. Dellamorte recites another poem, this one in the form of a pseudo-psalm. Death, death, death comes sweeping down, filthy death, the leering clown. Death on wings, death by surprise, veiling evil from worldly eyes. Death that's born as life succumbs, while death and love, two kindred drums, beat the time till judgment day, an actor in a passion play, without beginning, without end, evermore. Amen. An actor in a passion play without beginning or end, indeed. Dellamorte has one last thing to say before the unseen next chapter begins. You were my best friend. I didn't even realize it. Innocence, pure love, the kind that Nagi showed to Valentina. That was the best part of Franco, once upon a time. Pure love, Dellamorte. Nagi awakes, takes the gun that Dellamorte has used to kill his family, and tosses it into the abyss. The child is taking control of the fantasy. The hard cynicism has failed for the last time. No more silly jokes hiding dark truths. Nagi asks Dellamorte, "Can you take me home, please?" And Dellamorte answers, "Nah."